We're returning to carbon markets policy, but this time we're going to take the perspective of the market participants. So building on the discussion that we had earlier, but focus much more on the kind of market participants' experience. I'm still Ben Rattenbury. I'm still the VP for Policy at Silvera, and delighted to have with me three esteemed guests today. And as before, I will invite them each to introduce themselves. So maybe Dale, if you could go first.
Sure. So great to be here and see many of you again. Good afternoon. Dale Hardcastle. I work with Bain Company, head of carbon markets.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Waldman. I work at the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'm the Market Engagement Manager. Previously, I was at IETA doing voluntary carbon market formation. And before that, I was actually in the US government working at the National Institute of Standards and Technology doing greenhouse gas standards. Thank you.
And hi, everybody. I'm Noah Deitch with the Department of Energy here in the US, focused on our carbon management work.
Fantastic, thank you. And three people here really at the coalface, if we can still use that term, of the market and the way that it interacts with kind of policies and regulation at the well, you know what I mean. So to set up this conversation, I'm going to return to this theme of convergence, and it's something that we touched on with our policymaking panel earlier. But as I said, really keen to get your thoughts, kind of working directly with a large number of market participants, including Noah in your previous time at Carbon 180. And in our earlier panel, we heard a little bit about how in some ways the market is fragmenting. There has been a proliferation of standards from 20 just a few years ago now up to 70. In some ways it's getting more complex, more fragmented. In other ways, what good looks like is coming into sharper focus. And so in a way the means to the ends are getting broader, but the ends in terms of the carbon impact is actually getting clearer. So it's kind of an interesting take on this convergence thesis. But let's dive right in then. So maybe we could start with you, Dale, and see what you make of this idea about the different markets, international, voluntary, and domestic compliance markets merging. If you see that in your day-to-day work, and if so, where you think we are on this journey.
Well, I think it's very much a sort of a slow, steady march rather than sort of a sudden sort of step change. Yeah. Really kind of looking at kind of the progress that's been going on in I think many different sort of regions around the world and sort of jurisdictions over the last 3 to sort of 5 years as there's been sort of a slow sort of progressive sort of move. So it feels to me like we're sort of making progress on a sort of a gradual transition. Often I think like many things in the market such as infrastructure and other sort of standards, a lot of work that's sort of going on sometimes isn't always necessarily kind of visible on the surface, but it does seem like we are kind of building most sort of momentum across many different sort of schemes.
Fantastic, thanks Dale. How about you, Michaela?
So at the Integrity Council, what we do is we're a nonprofit independent governance organization that sets a threshold for high quality carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. And it's true, what we're seeing right now is a lot of emerging compliance schemes kind of popping up around the world. And what's so important and has a lot of impact is that a lot of these different compliance systems, talking about the voluntary carbon market, are having alignment with integrity standards with our core carbon principles. And this is hugely important because it can lead to interoperability between the voluntary carbon market and compliance systems. And this convergence around a high quality standard, which is our CCPs, will lead to scale and liquidity in these markets and ultimately drive impact and finance into developing countries and impactful climate projects.
So clear signs of the direction of travel there, but like Dale said, a slow and steady march perhaps. How about you, Noah? What's your take?
Yeah, so first and foremost, thank you all for inviting us here and for your leadership in the carbon market space. I actually don't see it as slow and steady. If you rewind just a few years ago, you could not have gone to the plethora of carbon market events, the science-based targets and net zero events here just this week. It was literally impossible to go to everything on this topic just because there's so much. And I think what's so clear now is that the world is committed to net zero. And in order to get to net zero, we have to get as close to actual zero as we can and net out the rest, which means we all have to start buying small and growing amounts carbon credits to actually get there. And the other side of this coin is I think all of our conversations, at least for me, have felt very nuanced, a lot of complexity. This is not an easy thing to do in many ways. But the other side of that equation is it actually is really easy to do now. You can just Google what Microsoft or Frontier or the US government is buying. You do not have to have that team and do all that diligence. A lot of folks have already done this work, and there are so many other resources. There are brokers out there that will help you buy portfolios of credits. There's ratings and insurance and all sorts of other mechanisms that can help. And so I think it's not only more obvious than ever that we need to do this, but it's easier than ever. And we don't need to overcomplicate it. And I think that message gets lost, that we can have pretty high confidence without an enormous amount of effort about heading in the right direction. And that to me is a very different place than we were even a few years ago. And I think sets us up for non-linear change, which we're going to need, because the market is still far too small to actually drive the climate finance that we need to see into projects in the near term, let alone the long term.
Thanks, Noah. No, that's great to hear, that this isn't a slow and steady march. This is taking off like a rocket ship, potentially, particularly in your area of CDR. Maybe we could dive into that a little bit more, because you founded Carbon 180 not that long ago in order to promote this idea of a wide range of high-quality carbon dioxide removals in the market. And now you're pursuing those goals from the US Department of Energy from quite a senior position. So how do things look different now that you're in government compared to before you joined? Kind of what's the new perspective like?
Well, so I think the new perspective is motivated by, one, this foundational policy framework here in the United States that provides tax credits and grants at the billion-dollar scale to a wide range of carbon removal solutions, helps really drive innovation. As our colleagues from the Treasury Department mentioned earlier, the US government is committed to high-integrity voluntary carbon markets, and we think carbon removal offers a great way to achieve that. And we also now have buyers who are paying what it costs to do some of the carbon removal innovation. And the fact that we have a voluntary carbon credit-based business model for every single carbon removal solution, it would have been completely unfathomable 5 years ago. Nobody was thinking about this. Nobody was willing to entertain $50 a ton, let alone 500. And I think what we're seeing is that folks recognize the value of investing in credits today at relatively small scales, even if the prices are high, because the potential for innovation is immense. And by investing today, we'll be able to drive down the price and secure supply to actually deliver our net zero targets with a really high integrity in the future. And that's a really critical component of a broader portfolio that's almost certainly going to be weighted towards emission avoidance credits in the near term, but will over time expand and grow into that removal space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you could quickly just set out exactly where you've got to with the removals program that you're overseeing, the competition and the prize. What's the latest? Because I know that's been moving very quickly as well.
Yeah, so our removals program overall is pretty broad. We announced a carbon negative shot as our framing directive. We fund a wide range of innovation projects. It's kind of the Department of Energy's bread and butter, funding engineering studies, analysis, grants to support small projects. The newest piece of this is the DOE is actually purchasing carbon removal credits. I think it's the first government to actually buy the credit, not just subsidize the project. And what we're hoping to do in that is both understand what we think the most promising projects are, and we've invested in 24 semifinalists across a number of different carbon removal verticals. But also, how do we start to understand what the art of the possible is for the best-in-class MMRV? Because we know that in some cases we have existing standards that have been published on registry, but not across all of the solutions. And what we're hoping to do is really understand what the art of the possible is today, so that we can get to a place where we have really clear definitions of what counts and what doesn't in the future. And so hopefully in early next year, we'll be announcing the 10 finalists that actually secure the purchase contract from us. But this is a pilot program. It will evolve, and we have additional funding for another round of purchases next year, and indication from Congress that we'll continue to get small and hopefully growing appropriations to support this type of credit purchasing into the future, because we think it can be really catalytic. And our hope is that our purchases can help make it more comfortable and easy for the voluntary markets and other purchasers around the world to start doing their own purchases. Because at the end of the day, this is going to have to be a public-private partnership in order to get the amount of finance as quickly as we need, given where we are today.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much for setting that out. And I know that many governments around the world are watching what you're doing really closely with interest and with envy, actually, because it really is starting to catalyze the market and show that the US can lead in this area. Michaela, I'd like to turn to you next. Given where you are in the ICVCM, you clearly have an overview of the whole market globally and also increasing the intersection between what the governments and the UNFCCC are doing, not just in the voluntary market. So looking around the world, where do you think are the most interesting developments right now in carbon markets more generally? And then I'll ask the same question to the other panelists.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing around the world is increasing alignment around a high integrity standard, and that, standard is the CCPs. And there are, like I said, many emerging schemes happening around the world. And following on what Noah said with the U.S. government and the DOE, there's also been the CFTC guidelines that came out and the interagency guidelines on the VCM. And increasing what we're seeing is this alignment with a high integrity standard. And this is, again, so important because with this alignment, then ultimately it will lead to this convergence of these markets. So the U.S. is leading the way. There's also, immense progress happening in Asia with Singapore's carbon tax. And again, we're seeing this alignment with this high integrity standard, which will ultimately lead to scale in this market.
Thanks, Michaela. Dale?
Yes, so I think there's definitely, many different sort of examples, and, maybe I will revisit my comment after hearing what Noah was saying about the kind of the U.S. Perhaps the bias of proximity, being a little bit too close. But it is, I think, quite sort of exciting that there are sort of quite numerous sort of examples as we look at, where this convergence and some efforts are sort of taking place. Recently, I guess even sort of in recent weeks, we saw kind of new announcement in sort of Rwanda with obviously Gen Zero and sort of gold standard, looking at kind of Article 6 credits there as well. I think a lot of excitement around, what potentially, could be coming in Brazil, with progress around the potential sort of legislation on the ETS there and some interconnectivity, with hope that maybe will go forward by the end of this year. And then, of course, I think it would be remiss not to also talk about what's been happening in the EU, with at least the earlier sort of consultation process in the UK before the change of government around looking at sort of removals and how that could be sort of integrated in the market. And then, obviously, I think also, finally, some of the momentum and sort of, energy that's sort of coming from the more integrated sort of standards in the EU itself around, standardization of sort of carbon accounting standards, the potential to incentivize sort of removals, sort of investments, more sort of focused domestically, but I think that brings sort of energy as well as sort of tying that together with sort of claims. And I'm sure we could probably rattle off, 4 or 5 other sort of examples as well.
That was a great overview, Dale, but I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to pick one. Where do you think right now is most interesting? Where are you kind of keeping the closest eye on in terms of the developments in the market?
Well, that's a tough one. Well, I guess I've been looking quite closely in our part of the world with sort of Singapore, just given, I think the interest and sort of the fact that that's relatively sort of close over the horizon, and although still more work to be done. But the fact that, I think that is a very sort of, tangible, given the degree to which it is kind of a carbon tax scheme, there's, direct ability to sort of compare and be able to look at, how that might go forward, and a lot of interest on what are the potential projects that are going to be deliverable into that. And I think a lot of interest from the VCM more broadly with, companies who like the insurance that sort of goes with that, even if it isn't necessary for Singapore, to be able to sort of, bid that.
Great, thanks, Dale. And how about you, Noah? Apart from the area that you're most familiar with, where do you think is most interesting right now in terms of developments in carbon markets?
So I'll focus specifically on the removal piece here. Obviously, there's been an enormous focus here in the United States, given the tax credits and other subsidies over the past few years. But I think what's really exciting is the number of countries that have started their own removals programs, all from very different perspectives. Some are thinking about purchasing removals directly, some about integrating into ETS systems or creating contracts for difference, others for subsidizing the voluntary purchases through various types of incentives on the production side. I don't actually think there is a right answer as long as the money flows. And that's really interesting because it's not happening in just one place, it's happening all over. And I think the power in that is not well understood, and it really is something that will move very quickly once we start to see some of these early planning stages, once the standards and methodologies are codified. I think from a government perspective, we try and be much more cautious about making sure that the credits that we accept, we're paying on delivery, we're making sure that they are verified to the highest standards. And so once that infrastructure is in place, the funding can move very quickly from a lot of corners around the world. And I think the question is now, how do we catalyze that and make government purchases around the world be something that can have this positive feedback loop feeding into the voluntary space as well, so that we are in fact converging and scaling at the same time.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's great to hear that the US is not alone in developing these innovative policies to scale the CDR market. I wonder if you can maybe call out a couple of places outside the US where you see this being done in really new or interesting ways.
Yeah, so I think we collaborate closely with our colleagues at the European Commission as they're developing the CRCF standard framework. We see that as a really important effort that can help bring some clarity about what counts and what doesn't, and how you actually do the MMRV associated with projects. We're very excited about integration into ETS systems. Colleagues in Japan are working on that, as well as just to our north, the Canadians are looking at how they can purchase carbon removal as part of a CDR or SAF procurement mandate. And again, this diversity I think is really exciting because it means that projects can happen across all of those different geographies, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer here. The key is that we just have to do it in a way that makes sense for those national policy contexts.
Fantastic. Thanks, Noah. Michaela, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the kind of similarities and differences that you see between what ICVCM is doing to promote integrity in voluntary markets and the efforts underway in the UNFCCC. Because I know that there's kind of a healthy interchange there between both personnel and also ideas between those two bodies. And yeah, what does that look like from your perspective?
So with the ICVCM and Article 6 from the UNFCCC, they're really complementary processes. And what the Integrity Council does is we look at methodologies and programs and assess them to determine high quality, high threshold for carbon credits. And what Article 6 is doing is looking at integrity in the carbon markets for compliance systems. And then the UN has oversight over countries' NDCs. What's unique and what's really helpful with what the ICVCM is doing in the voluntary carbon market is we're getting project developers and countries ready for when Article 6 is operational, because we're putting out a standard that's really high quality, and they're being able to implement these high quality standards and be ready for when Article 6 becomes operational. And then also what the VCM is allowing for is this development of infrastructure around these markets, so that, again, when Article 6 becomes operational, it will already be in place and the market will be ready to scale at the pace that we're hoping it does. And then also, as Article 6 continues to evolve and the ICVCM, we're working quite closely with them. They have an observer seat on our board, and then we're also working with the supervisory body as they develop their standard.
Fantastic. So really close alignment there developing between these two key market actors. The time is racing away, but I want us to focus in our last few minutes on guidance for the market and market participants. And specifically, the title of this panel is around creating certainty. So I'd like to ask each of you, maybe starting with you, Dale, where in the world right now you see kind of the clearest frameworks or the most certainty emerging, and where do you think that's going to come down the track quickest for those that are looking for kind of the next area to invest?
Well, I think the clearest probably ties back to, as I referred to earlier, where we see sort of, carbon tax regimes, because I think it's probably sort of easier to sort of connect the dots there, and looking, for where those opportunities are. I think from kind of our sort of experience in sort of working with, I think, different sort of corporates and potential investors in the market, there's, I think, a high degree of sort of interest in where there is, optionality and the ability to, potentially have deliverability against, different schemes, be it kind of, I think, the voluntary market, but also sort of the carbon tax, and of course, as and where there may be options with CORSIA or sort of other things. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Michaela?
Government regulation is critical, and what government regulation does is it will bring confidence into this market, and it will incentivize participation from buyers and countries so that this market can really scale. This comes in the example of green claims and disclosure regulations, if they're done right, are really important for bringing back this confidence. And then also, as I've mentioned, alignment around high integrity standards for the supply, very critical for this market to scale, and those standards are the CCPs. This will have the same impact in terms of bringing back confidence and delivering the finance that we need to developing countries.
Thanks. And Noah?
And I'll take the liberty of answering this in a more meta direction. But I think where we have the most confidence now is that now is the time for action. We look at all of the analysis that every country runs, the companies run about how do we get to net zero aligned with our Paris Agreement targets. We have to start investing in carbon credits today alongside really ambitious direct emission reductions. And so I think that is where the confidence in this market comes from, is that we have run the analysis and we know we need to do this. The question is now, how do we have the confidence in what we are doing actually provides the highest value? And I think that's where the field is evolving so quickly, both on the technology side and what solutions offer the greatest promise, in what geographies, in what timeframes, as well as what types of protocols we need to follow to actually make that claim. Because at the end of the day, integrity is the product when it comes to these carbon credits. If we do not have confidence, they really don't exist. And so I think it's that combination of how do we operationalize something that is crystal clear now that we have to do, and that's what's different from just a few years ago in my mind.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, I couldn't agree more. But I do want to be a bit cheeky and put to you a question that I heard from the floor earlier about contango. Essentially, I think the question was, why should a company invest in CDR now when all of the price curves suggest it's only going to get cheaper over time? So, I mean, you were saying a minute ago that now is the time, and I would agree. I think there's lots of strong arguments there, but I'm interested in your thought on this question.
Yeah, I think it's a misleading question because they only get cheaper over time if you invest now. So it's not actually a reasonable premise. And I think that's the hardest thing, is that in order for that statement to be true, we have to invest now. And there's always the collective action problem of, I'll just wait, I'll be first to be second, right? And that's just not gonna work in this space. And I think it's very clear that investing now is essential. There also are very, I'll call it, more selfish reasons to do this. Folks who invest now can build the capacity. They can demonstrate to their constituents, their shareholders, employees, customers, regulators, that they care about this and are leaders. And they can also secure rights of future supply, which are increasingly seen as valuable in the market as we get to a place where the mandate for purchasing credits will become more and more clear. And so I think it's not just we have to do this if we want it in the future, but there's a lot of investment rationale for a self-interested actor today.
Absolutely, and I think you've also been designing some innovative policy tools such as leaderboards and so on in order to kind of give profile to companies that do take the first step here.
Yeah, so we've announced a voluntary carbon removal purchasing challenge. What we're hoping to show is just investing today is something to be applauded. We're going to finalize the challenge and release it soon, but in the meantime, we've already had corporate leaders step up. Google has announced that they're going to match our $35 million of purchasing, and we expect that there will be lots of other leaders seeing that really as just the entry stakes for many of the early movers. But our goal here is to welcome in as broad a tent as possible. Part of the issue, especially in the carbon removal space, is we have the same set of first movers, and those first movers are great. We just need lots of fast followers. There are thousands of companies with net zero targets in the not too distant future that all need to be investing at small and growing scales today. And what we hope to do is welcome them into this CDR purchasing journey now, so that we can build the expertise, invest in the innovation, make sure that we have the MMRV protocols, and be in a place in a few years where we have great confidence and the supply needed to meet the demand.
I like it. So you don't need first movers, you need fast followers now. That's kind of where we've got to. Great. Dale, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, your work puts you in front of many of the world's largest corporations that are interested in carbon markets, and you must get a wide range of interesting kind of questions and challenges that they pose to you. How do you see the corporate experience as a whole across the cross-section that you see evolving? Kind of the market is getting more complex in some ways maybe, but it's also becoming clearer in other ways. What's the main trend there, and how does that affect the advice that you're giving at the moment?
So I think it's a great question, and difficult at the same time to generalize and say, this is how sort of all sort of companies sort of see the world sort of today. Clearly the market has evolved in many ways that we hadn't sort of anticipated over the last 4 or 5 sort of years. In some ways maybe diametrically opposed to what we had as expected, and I think we really see a bit of a kind of dichotomy sort of today as we sort of look at sort of companies and how they're sort of looking at the market. On the one hand, there's been, I think, great strides seen with the kind of early movers and sort of other sort of companies within the market. Sophistication has increased sort of greatly, much more sort of acute in terms of how they look at their procurement and sort of financing and many, many other things, and being very, very specific about what they want. But that, of course, has, on the flip side, has come at a price, right? And that we have, moved all of that sort of market development out of the market and sort of moved it more into direct investment in the primary market. So I think there's kind of a wide sort of variety of companies who are sort of looking to be the fast followers, who, while on the one hand, as Noah said, you can benefit from all of the knowledge of Microsoft and everything that has been put out there, but there still is, I think, a great deal of complexity as they're trying to sort of get their head around things. And very much, I guess, to use another sort of quote, always sort of go back to the Jeremy Irons famous scene in Margin Call, where he says he's sitting down with sort of the analyst trying to explain to him the financial crisis and how the bank is about to go down the toilet, and says, explain this to me like I'm a small child who's stupid and doesn't understand anything. And I think a lot of sort of companies don't want the complexity, they want sort of simplicity. So I think as we sort of go forward, the challenge is really how can we sort of strike the balance between in continuing sort of the sophistication that we've sort of seen that is helping sort of incentivize innovation and sort of other things, but also as we sort of scale the market, don't sort of make it sort of so complicated that we scare people off with quality and sort of other concerns.
Absolutely, I know there's definitely a danger of overcomplicating things, whereas actually it's fundamentally not so tough. Thank you very much to the panel. Please join me in appreciating.